So I know I promised a wonderful celebration of that Women's World Cup team and their joy and their brashness. And then I ran into that poem by Janae Johnson, and I started remembering my grandmother. In some ways, what I'm talking about today is the recent changes, the changes of my lifetime, the changes that happened before many of you were even born. But we can't even imagine how much it had already changed by the time they got to me. I didn't even know, because my grandmother didn't talk about basketball. Sometime in her late 70s, my grandmother fell in love with the Chicago Bulls. It may have been the fact that Michael Jordan was playing. And you have to realize my grandmother always wore her hair in a very tidy little white bun on top of her head. And then she had her Chicago Bulls baseball cap that she would perch on top of it to watch every single game. And she would talk about the players and what they were doing. And for the first time, she started telling me stories about how they played basketball when she was in school. So my grandmother was born in 1911. That means she was in high school in the 1920s. And I suppose we could all be amazed that, yes, they were playing girls' basketball when she was in high school. But they didn't play the same game. Now, girls and women's sports still have some different rules now. The rims aren't always at the same height. Three-point lines can be a little bit different. A few other rules here and there. But the way she described having to play basketball. And she really wanted to play, but this is the rules they had to play by. So, for those of you who are not big basketball people, you've got the basket that you want to put the ball in, and you got the basket your team is defending to keep the other team from putting the ball in that basket. And usually, we see teams run back and forth, because the same people are always on offense or on defense, depending on where the ball is. Not in my grandmother's team. They were worried you might have to run too much. You might get overly exerted. It might be too much work. Might get overheated. So one part of the team was always the offense, and one part of the team was always the defense. And so that way you only had to run on one half of the court. So you only had half as far as you could run in playing the game. But there was still too much chance they might get too rambunctious or get too much sweat going. So they could dribble the ball and run with the ball. That's what you do in basketball, but only twice. So you could take 2 steps while dribbling the ball, and then you had to pass it and send it to somebody else, because you had obviously run enough already. And when you passed the ball, it had to be a bounce pass, because you wouldn't want to get that ball going too fast or too out of control or not know for sure where it was coming from. And that was how my grandmother learned to play basketball. Dribble the ball twice, bounce pass. Dribble the ball twice, bounce pass, till somebody's in a position to take a shot. If the defense gets that ball, they can dribble it twice, and then they have to bounce pass it to the other end of the court, and their offense takes over. And that was basketball for girls. Now, those rules were long gone, but that same mentality about what it meant for girls to be involved in sports, it showed up in other ways. And you don't get from a place where, okay, you can play kind of, sort of, but by different rules, to where we are now without something big changing. And that something big was actually, in some ways, completely accidental. It was Title IX. And part of the reason I wanted to talk about that today was right now as a country, we're talking about what has happened in the past and what it takes to change. There were hearings recently about reparations, and people are still fighting over whether or not the repercussions of people's ancestors having been slaves and not paid for their labor might still cause an impact on their descendants or not. Does it matter if our schools are integrated or not? If the justice with the police is equal or not? We talk about redress, and it's so hard to imagine what impact it could make. And that's part of why I wanted to look at women in sports, because it's one of those times when, even without meaning to, they just changed the rules. And everything about how it is now happened because they changed the rules first. Those women that we celebrated in the World Cup, oh, they were so proud and so joyous. So many of us found such joy in celebrating with them. And part of it was because we got to see them glorying in their individual differences, their uniqueness as people, and the fact they'd been given the chance to be absolutely all that they could ever be. So we watched Morgan Bryan and Abby Dahlkemper and Tierna Davidson and Crystal Dunn and Julie Ertz and Adriana Franch and Ashley Harris and Tobin Heath and Leslie Horan and Ali Krieger and Rose Lavelle. Oh, that goal that she scored, it was gorgeous. And Carly Lloyd and Allie Long and Jessica McDonald and Sam Mewis and Alex Morgan and Alyssa Naher and Kelly O'Hara and Kristen Press and Mallory Pugh and, oh, we all heard about Megan Rapinoe and Becky Sauerbrunn and Emily Sonnet. They're the women who brought home the 4th World Cup. DJ earlier said that there was not a national women's team until 1985. Well, there was not a Women's World Cup until 1991. And they've never had a parade and a celebration like they had this year. My favorite comment about how much we celebrated this year and how different that celebration was also kind of hit a little close to home when someone said, the little boys are wearing jerseys with the women athletes' names on them. That is a marker is hard, but it is also one that should be celebrated because, oh, the fact that up till now, that was unimaginable. So that date, 1991, that's the year I graduated from college. So the first 20-something years of my life, when they said the World Cup, they did not have to designate a team because there was only one. There was only one World Cup. There was only one competition. There was no men's team and women's team. And I'll just note that for the purposes of the reflection, at the time, they were very much looking at biological gender as they understood it then. So we're talking boys and girls and men and women. And we know that's not all there is about gender and sex. But 1991 was the first year there was a World Cup in which the competitors were not men. And the road to get there, in many ways, started in 1972. So 1972 was the year that Congress passed and President Nixon, of all people, signed the Education Amendments Act of 1972. And as DJ said earlier, this is one of those things they called an omnibus bill, which means they wanted to change a whole bunch of stuff all at once. And you heard the text of Title IX earlier, and it just said that you cannot be discriminated against on the basis of sex. And that Title IX, the main champions for it in the House were Representatives Bernice Sandler, Representative Edith Green, and Representative Patsy Mink. Patsy Mink is the one who developed the beginning text when she was on the House Subcommittee on Higher Education, Representative Green chaired. And the person on the Senate side who was its biggest champion was actually Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana. And they were not thinking about sports. When Representative Green started talking about doing something like this, she was talking about math and science and how we can ensure that girls had a chance to study and learn. In fact, when they were developing this legislation, every once in a while somebody might make a comment about, does this mean sports? But they didn't think about that. And in fact, the advocates for it, for Title IX, as it came to be called, didn't want anybody talking about it at all. Representative Green specifically asked all of the women's rights groups to not come to hearings because she did not want much attention, because if there was attention, there would be backlash before it was even passed. She wanted it to be a quiet little piece that people didn't notice so much in the bigger bill. In fact, one of the few times sports came up was in the Senate committee. Somebody made a joke about whether that meant they would have to have co-ed showers. But that was about it. And part of the reason why there was so little attention on this little part of that bill was because all the fight was on another part of it. That was the part that talked about segregation and busing. By 1972, you'd already had Brown versus the Board of Education. You had court-ordered desegregation in certain parts of the country. And they had started doing busing to move people around to different schools because that was the only way to mix up the classes, because people lived in different parts of town. And the fight in this piece of legislation was all about how much they could stop that from happening, how much they could throttle back desegregation of the schools. So in the debates, when you heard Senator Joe Biden and Senator Kamala Harris talking about busing policy in the 70s, that was this same bill. And think about the trajectory of those two things, because this bill really did throttle the very beginnings of serious attempts at desegregation of our schools based on race. At the very same time that it included Title IX, that opened up the floodgates for saying that there has to be equal opportunity within those schools based on gender. And you look at what's happened since 1972. We can't say for sure what would have happened had our schools become more integrated, but we can look at what happened for the group of us who got more opportunity. We can look at what our schools look like now And one of the ways to crystallize that is just around the sports. Because back before Title IX and in its very beginnings, if girls wanted to play, the first thing they had to do was have a fight. Fight with the school board, fight with the coach, fight in the courts. We went from 1972 from a place where the school could just say, we just don't have space or money or coaches or anything for girls to play, to having to say, oh, we have to find ways to ensure that the girls can play. I am only a few years older than Title IX, so most of the time I was in school, they were still trying to figure this out. We didn't even get to trying team sports when I was in school till junior high. I remember them trying to teach us in 2 weeks of gym class, 3 days a week, how to play lacrosse. Those big sticks with the balls in them, trying to figure out how to teach us to throw enough with them and catch enough with them to say, hey, you want to have a team? You can't learn enough in 2 weeks to have a team. And that's why that opportunity to get a chance to play is the important part of all of this. My next sister is only 6 years younger than me. By the time she got to school, they were playing team sports in elementary school. There were club teams for sports for girls. She was playing soccer at 5 and basketball at 7. She was on her school varsity team in both. And all along the way, the schools were trying to find ways, oh, we gotta make more. Law says we have to give them a chance to play. When my sister went off to college in the late 90s, she was on the very first women's soccer team at Clemson University. They had finally realized, oh, if we really want to chase for them to play, we have to make teams. And so many of the women who played on that national team were not even born then yet. The reason they have those skills and those talent, they have the talent, but the skills, the ability to play the way they have, is because they got the chance to play. They had teams and fields and coaches. They had uniforms. Well, for soccer, you don't get changing rooms. We got really good with my sister's team of how do you hold one shirt while changing another shirt over it so you can change in the middle of the field. But you gotta got all that stuff. You gotta have the uniforms. And the reason they're amazing as they are is they got the chance to play. And many of them got that chance because they first made a law that said they needed to have equal opportunity to play. And so when those old questions come up about the impact of decisions made long ago, about how racism and sexism and all the otherisms come up when we discuss the impact of slavery and Jim Crow, or lack of maternity leave, or unequal pay. We never know what changing the system can lead to. We can't predict for sure. But just look at what that change in Title IX did. All those women who got a chance to be the best player they could be. And for us to watch them play, just like my grandmother could not have imagined basketball the way the WNBA plays it now. None of us can imagine what would be possible if we insisted on that level playing field and took seriously what it would take to create that level field for all of us. Because then, imagine the country we'd see. And that joy that so many of us felt, that celebration of the uniqueness of that person in that moment, of getting to see them had that chance to grow and shine. Can you imagine what that would be like if it was all of us? If everybody got the chance to really grow into the best of themselves. And we can help make that world, even if none of us can imagine it yet.